Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I welcome you all in today's session, and we're going to talk about the historical development of organizational development practices in different time frames. Different contributions were coming up in the field. For example, laboratory training, action research and survey feedback, normative approach, quality of work life, strategic change, and then gradually we moved from the 1950s to the new millennium, and then we are in the current situation. In today's session, we're going to cover the whole historical perspective that how this organizational development framework actually developed, how laboratory training contributed in the field, how action research and survey feedback were there to support the ideas, then the normative approaches, quality of work life, and strategic change. So all of these contributions would be discussed in detail in the coming slides and in the coming videos. So the current practice is obviously the time in which we are right now discussing with one another. This is 2021, and obviously the field of organization development has taken many leaps and bounds and many turns, and we are in a situation now in which the big MNCs can be tackled. We are in a situation that we are available with a lot of more research. We are available with a lot of more in-depth knowledge related to the organizational facilities as well as the consultancy practices. So to start our discussion, first of all, we're going to watch a video by Bob Marshak, and he's going to talk about making sense of organization development and the historical discourse, the discourse in which different events were actually taking place. So let's listen to him.
In the Taoist tradition, the Tao Te Ching said the Tao produced the one produced the two produced the three, and the three produced the 10,000 things. Here we begin to understand how what we see today, the many blossoms of organization development and its many manifestations, all get linked back to some original core principles. So broadly speaking, if we want to make sense of OD, to know the way of OD, it's helpful to know its roots and branches and how its beginnings have led to the many manifestations we see today. Broadly speaking, OD had its roots in the 1940s and 50s. Its foundations established in the 1960s and 70s. Significant branches emerged in the 1980s and 90s, and we are experiencing the blossoming of the 10,000 OD things today. So let's take a look at the roots for a moment. The roots of OD are directly traceable to the thinking of the German social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who emigrated to the United States in the 1930s to escape Nazi Germany. Lewin in the 1940s set forth a number of interrelated values, premises, and practices that I will call the three beginnings, which are still the fundamental roots of all or most all OD practices to this very day. These include, in terms of values, the steadfast belief in a few core values to shape all change work in human systems. This included, importantly and primarily, a belief in democracy, a belief in the positive potential of people, and a belief of the use of scientific rationality to address social issues. In terms of premises or theories, a second beginning were two core premises that guided his approach to change. One premise was his field theory that postulated that all behavior is a function of a set of internal and external forces operating on a situation, and that to change behavior, you need to change the field of forces. The second core premise was the primacy of small groups in the change process, that the target of change was not just the individual as an isolated entity, but instead behavior in the context of a small group. This also included the notion that small groups had their own needs, such as leadership, norms, decision-making, working through conflict, and that these needs should be attended to in the change process. In terms of practices, the third beginning was two practices that he advocated as central concerns of any change process. One was the use of action research, wherein members of a social system are involved in the investigation of their own situation, their own field of forces, and were asked to then develop their own potential changes. These were then tried out and further studied and modified as necessary in a continuous iterative process of investigation, experimentation, and learning. Thus, the notion of democracy was also extended to the diagnostic and change planning processes. This differs from other change approaches where these steps were usually performed by an elite or expert group or individual. The second practice related to change was his recognition that changes needed to be sustainable, that change were not lasting and they could revert back to old behavior relatively easily. Thus, his famous conception that change included unfreezing, movement, but then importantly, rephrasing a social system. This was the way to achieve sustainability, and he built it into his fundamental premise of initiating change, but always with an insight towards sustaining change at the end. This also related to his research that found that changes adopted in a group context were more likely to be sustained than in an individual context. These three beginnings were further developed by Lewin's associates and followers in the 1950s, leading to what we have come to know as OD in the foundational period of the 1960s and 70s. In the foundational period, the three beginnings set forth by Lewin were expanded and further modified into a set of underlying values, theories, and practices that outlined what has become known to most people as organization development, or the classical period of organization development. These included several major types of ideas, including the following: scientific positivism. In other words, a belief that the world was objective and could be investigated, measured, and changed using rationality and logic. This was part of action research, but also Lewin's foundation as a social scientist, as well as most of his followers. An interest in social psychological theories are in essence, group dynamics, based on the primacy of small groups. This, of course, in this period led to teams and team building and a great interest in groups as part of organization development work, small groups, that is. Organizations were considered to be open systems and not the mechanistic structures that had been part of the preceding thinking about organizations. A positive view of people and their potential. This built on the humanistic psychology theories that were developed in the 1950s, for example, Maslow. Action research, and then later Schein's innovation on process consultation, looking at how a system operated and consulting to the how and not the what. The notion that change can be planned, and the early books in the late 50s and 60s that founded the field were all about the planning of change. And the change was also episodic. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end to change. And so we went from unfreezing movement to refreezing a system. And finally, all of this was based on the early premises of democratic values, positive view of people, the notion of intended outcomes that were based on humanistic conceptions of people. This was the dominant form of OD in the 60s and the 70s. However, in the 1980s, we began to get significant branches. These were developed by practitioners innovating in a number of areas and also influenced by the changes in the social sciences that were beginning to come into the field in the 1980s and 1990s. So the roots and the foundations of OD had been established, but now we began to get significant branches. And these included new ideas that came into the field that shaped practices. One important was social construction as a way of thinking about the world linked to postmodern practices. In other words, we had left the world of objective social science and moved into more subjectivity and the idea that reality was a social construct. This influenced a number of newer approaches, including, importantly, appreciative inquiry. The move to begin to look at interventions not based on groups of 10 or 12, but at groups of 100, the large group interventions that began to be developed in this time period. Organizations were now conceived not only as open systems, but as meaning-making systems, where the individuals in them created the meaning that was part of what they did. This was tied to social construction. And now they're beginning to understand that change needed to be about changing the meaning that people made about the systems. Action research was expanded into a broader notion of action inquiry and engagement, where change could emerge from the act of inquiry alone and not by what was found. Greater numbers of people were involved in the process, and the processes of action inquiry were expanded from action research, which was usually guided by a social scientist in the foundation period. Discursive studies, these began to come in on the linguistic turn in the social sciences and the importance of language as something that not only reported reality, but shaped reality. And therefore, what people said or how they said it. Changing the conversation began to be a notion of how you created change in systems. Change expanded from being episodic and planned to being the notion of chaotic change, the notion of self-organizing change, the notion that change is continuous. And people began experimenting with processes that no longer thought about refreezing a system so much as guiding the fluid nature of a system. And the fundamental values that guided the field, democracy, humanistic values, continued, but now they were being added to in terms of additional ideas that were related to paying attention to environmental impacts, broader social consequences of what organizations did. So we had an expanded set of humanistic, democratic, and value-based values that shaped the field and began to have an impact on what people did. One important dimension of this included that with the expansion of OD into newer contexts, the demographic shifts in North America, the expansion of OD around the world, was the increased attention to cross-cultural and diverse populations in terms of OD practices as well as OD interventions. Thus, diversity and inclusion also became an interest in the 1980s and 90s and a central feature of organization development. Today, we see the blossoming of OD. We see a cornucopia of possibilities so rich and so varied that people have lost sight of what the early beginnings were. What we have today is a field that draws on the many different possibilities. So we have people now who are drawing from the original choices, small groups, action research, and also people drawing on the newer approaches, large groups, social construction. And they are mixing them in a variety of new and innovative ways. And the people who practice this, of course, all believe that what they are doing is the one right way to do things. And I think understanding the context is very important in understanding how to mix and match these choices. And so we have blended approaches and blended ways of doing things. Some people are working in the complexity sciences. And so for them, change is a self-organizing phenomena. Change is a phenomena that is perhaps by changing the conversation as we move along, and they are advocating different ways to approach organizations in that way. People who do appreciative inquiry have expanded it to appreciative inquiry summits, where they draw together large groups of people in extended conversations about doing inquiry into the positive aspects of systems. These are all ways that these different new trends have been blended and matched and mixed to create a wide range of possibilities for you. However, for myself, I think too many people today have lost sight of the origins and foundations. I think too many people know their branch, but not how it's connected to other branches. So I think if we want to take full advantage of all the blossoms and all our practices that we witness today, I think we need to remember the roots and the three beginnings of Lewin and all the interrelated members of the organization development family. So finally, as you think about what you know about OD and the premises and practices and values that guide your work, I hope you will reflect some on or learn more about how what you are doing in OD has developed over time and where what you are doing or seek to do fits in the full context of the way of OD from its inception more than 70 years ago. Thank you for your time and attention.
All righty, we were just listening to Bob Marshak, and he was telling us the developmental stages of organizational development and how they are contributing towards the current blossoming time and era. How it started from the
Hello, I'm Bob
experiments of Kurt
Marshak, and I'm
Lewin.
delighted to be able to share in this short.
Let's start with the detail in a more concrete manner. When the laboratory testing or training were the norms back in 1946, the Kurt Lewin basically was the person who came up with this idea of T groups. The T stands for training groups, and the team building exercises for training community leaders. So the conclusion which is drawn out of his work is number one, feedback about group interaction was a rich learning experience. And the second conclusion was the process of group building had potential for learning that could be transferred to back home situations. So these were the two conclusions which came out of the exercises done during 1946, and that is the same type of outcomes which we have received through the Hawthorne studies, the experiments which were done at General Electric plant. So Hawthorne studies were also coming up with the group context, group formations, group norms, group values, and group building potentials and exercises, जिसमें कि हम ये जान पाए कि आपस में जब लोग इंटरेक्ट करते हैं तो व्हाट कैन बी द आउटकम्स और वो कौन से नॉर्म्स हैं जो एक्चुअली उनकी प्रोग्रेस को, उनकी प्रोडक्टिविटी को वो लीड करते हैं. Moving towards the action research and survey feedback, it is said that the action research contribution began in 1940 with studies conducted by social scientists like John Kohler, Kurt Lewin, and William White. So they discovered, back in 1940, they discovered that research needed to be closely linked to action. Okay, ये वो टाइम फ्रेम है जिस वक्त OD is taking up its shape, ठीक है? So the research needed to be closely linked to action if organization members were to use it to manage change. ठीक है, तो जो action oriented research था, that is that thing which that is the term which actually evolved out of the need. उसके बाद the next conclusion which was like we are getting out of this action research and survey feedback stem 2, and it is talking about a collective effort, or rather a collaborative effort was initiated between organization and social scientists to collect research data, to analyze it for cause of problems, and to devise the implement solutions. ओके, तो ये हमारे पास आगे चलकर टिपिकल स्टेप्स भी बन गए ऑर्गेनाइजेशन डेवलपमेंट पर्सपेक्टिव को इंप्लीमेंट करने के लिए जो फेजेस हमारे पास डेवलप हो रही थी. तो वी हैव टू कलेक्ट द रिसर्च डेटा, वी हैव टू एनालाइज द कॉजेज ऑफ द प्रॉब्लम जिसको हम डायग्नोसिस के नाम से अब जानते हैं, एंड वी हैव टू डिवाइज एंड इंप्लीमेंट सॉल्यूशंस जिसको हम इंटरवेंशंस के नाम से वो अब जानते हैं. सो दीज वर द टाइम्स जब ये एक्सपेरिमेंट्स जो थे दे वर शेपिंग अप द होल स्टोरी. सो द रिजल्ट ऑफ एक्शन रिसर्च वर टू फोल्ड. The first result was that the members of organizations were able to use research on themselves to guide action and change. And the second outcome was that social scientists were able to study that process to drive new knowledge that could be used elsewhere. Okay, तो ये दो हमारे पास मेन आउटकम्स जो थे ये एक्शन रिसर्च एंड सर्वे फीडबैक के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में डेवलप हुए बैक इन ईयर 1940s. So the classic research B. Lester, Koch, and John French on overcoming resistance to change that led to the development of participative management. अब ये टर्म भी हमारे सामने बड़ी पॉपुलर है मैनेजमेंट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में. सो पार्टिसिपेटिव मैनेजमेंट के अंदर भी जो मेन कंसर्न था वो रेजिस्टेंस टू चेंज को ओवरकम करने की एफर्ट्स थी. And another expression is that the key component of most action research studies was the systematic collection of survey data that was feedback to the client organization. And obviously आप लोग भी अपने इस सारे प्रोजेक्ट वर्क में जो आपने कोर्स वर्क में करना है आप इसी प्रोसीजर को फॉलो करोगे कि यू विल बी कलेक्टिंग द कंप्लीट डेटा और उस डेटा को एनालाइज करके यू विल बी रीचिंग टू द प्रॉब्लम एंड उस प्रॉब्लम को फिर आपने इंटरवेंशंस में लेकर जाना है एंड the feedback is to be given to the client organization. तो ये हमारे पास एक पूरा प्रोसेस होगा ओडी के प्रोजेक्ट को टेक अप करने का. इसके बाद Lewin died in 1947. His research center for group dynamics at MIT moved to Michigan and joined with the Survey Research Center as part of the Institute of Social Research headed by Francis Likert, a pioneer in developing scientific approach to attitude surveys. Okay, तो अब 1947 तक हम पहुंचे हैं जहां पर हमें scientific approach to attitude surveys का जो context है वो evolve होना शुरू हो गया. And remember when we talk about the scientific approaches, तो we are talking about observation, prediction, deduction, experimentation. तो एक पूरे process से गुजरकर हम चीजों को investigate करने की कोशिश करते हैं rather than कि हम सिर्फ अपनी intuition पर rely वो करें. So in an early study by the Institute, Likert and Floydman administered company-wide surveys and shared findings with the company. So the research felt that this was a powerful process for change. So new findings jo thi, with the passage of time, they were evolving. Likert and Mann derived several conclusions about the effects of survey feedback on organization change. This led to extensive application of survey feedback methods in a variety of settings. और obviously जब हम survey feedbacks की बात करेंगे तो उन surveys के हमारे पास different methods होंगे. We can go for collecting the data through questionnaires. We can go for collecting the data through interviews, observation. So there would be different focus groups. So there will be different ways जिससे कि हम अपने surveys जो हैं वो conduct करेंगे to collect the data about the organizational facility, about the problem for which we are hired. Now, moving towards the normative approaches, it was found that a human relations approach represented a one best way to manage organizations. So, ये काफी popular slogan management में रहा कि there is one best way of doing things. But with the passage of time, people realized that there can be many ways जिससे कि हम same optimized solutions हासिल वो कर सकते हैं. So, Bahran, that was with the passage of time, the evolution took place. Initially, it was thought कि एक ही तरीका होता है best काम को करने का. So, Likert's participative management हमारे पास एक पूरा context develop हुआ. उसमें first of all, we came up with the idea कि exploitative authoritative systems they needed to be developed. Okay, जो कि top down autocratic style को follow करते थे. Then another system was introduced which was benevolent authoritative system और benevolent authoritative system में था तो वो top down लेकिन it was less autocratic. फिर third system devise किया गया organizational investigations के लिए developmental perspectives के लिए and that was consultative systems जिसमें कि consultants central decision making की authority के साथ वहाँ पर available हुए. And then the fourth system, which was rather more practical in today's world, it was evolved and developed, and that started talking about participative perspective, जिसमें कि high degree of member participation जो थी, उसको welcome किया गया. So again, we can see कि top-down autocratic approaches से हम participative high degree of member participation तक वो पहुंच रहे हैं. Likert, applied system for management to organizations using a survey feedback process. So the intervention generally started with organization members completing the profile of organizational characteristics. अब हम प्रोफाइल ऑफ ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स को भी गो थ्रू करेंगे कि किस तरीके से ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के प्रोफाइल्स जो थे उनको मेंटेन वो किया गया. So the reason being that why we are going through the history context कि हम अब ओडी की डेवलपमेंट में हिस्ट्री को गो थ्रू क्यों कर रहे हैं, उसका मेन रीजन डियर ये है कि हम कहीं पर री इन्वेंट द व्हील वो ना करना शुरू कर दें. अगर हम पहिए को दोबारा इजाद करने बैठ गए तो विल बी वेस्टिंग ऑल दोज इयर्स अगेन. ओके, तो हिस्ट्री को पढ़ लेने से हमें सबसे बड़ा जो बेनिफिट मिलता है वो ये होता है कि हम कंक्लूजन्स पर पहुंच सकते हैं रादर देन कि हम अपने एक्सपेरिमेंट से दोबारा से पहिए को इजाद करने की कोशिश वो करें. So group members explain the discrepancy between their present situation and their ideal, generally using system 4 as the ideal benchmark, and generated action plans to move the organization towards system 4 conditions. Okay, now let's see कि ये जो profile of organizational characteristics थी इनको कैसे maintain किया गया. Now this is a table in front of you which is talking about the profile of organization characteristics. इसमें अब हमारे पास डिफरेंट तरह के सिस्टम्स वो अवेलेबल है, सिस्टम 1 2 3 4. अब इनको हम क्रॉस कंपैरिजन में देखते हैं, और क्रॉस कंपैरिजन इन सिस्टम्स का बनाने के लिए हमारे पास सर्टेन कंस्ट्रक्ट्स हैं जिसके ऊपर ये सिस्टम्स बिल्डअप हो रहे हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल, on the left side you can see कि हमारे पास construct number 1 is communication, construct number 2 is leadership, construct number 3 is policies. Okay, जब हम कम्युनिकेशन की बात करते हैं तो द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज हाउ इज डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन एक्सेप्टेड. हमने कहा ये टॉप डाउन होगा, तो हाउ इज डाउनवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन एक्सेप्टेड. तो सिस्टम 1 में विद सस्पिशन, वेयर एज सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज एक्सेप्टेड रेडिली. अब दोबारा अगला क्वेश्चन देखिए कम्युनिकेशन में, हाउ इज अपवर्ड कम्युनिकेशन एक्सेप्टेड. तो वहां पर सिस्टम 1 में इट वाज सस्पिशियस, जबकि सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज रेडिली एक्सेप्टेड. व्हाई? बिकॉज पार्टिसिपेशन वहां पर कॉल की जा रही थी. कम्युनिकेशन में क्वेश्चन नंबर 3 को देखिए, व्हाट इज द डायरेक्शन ऑफ कम्युनिकेशन. सिस्टम 1 में इट वाज डाउन, सिस्टम 2 में वी कैन सी मोस्टली डाउन, सिस्टम 3 में वी कैन से दैट डाउन एंड अप, बोथ वे कम्युनिकेशन जा रही थी क्योंकि कंसल्टेंट इन्वॉल्व हो गए थे. लेकिन सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज ऑल चैनल, जिसमें कि कम्युनिकेशन वाज डाउन अप एंड साइडवेज एज वेल. लीडरशिप कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखिए कि आर आइडियाज ऑफ सबऑर्डिनेट सॉट एंड यूज्ड. सिस्टम 1 में बहुत कम, सेल्डम, जबकि सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज ऑलवेज. अगला क्वेश्चन देखिए लीडरशिप का, व्हाट इज द डिग्री ऑफ वार्मथ एंड सपोर्ट बिटवीन सबऑर्डिनेट्स एंड देयर लीडर्स. तो सिस्टम 1 में इट वाज नन, नो इन्वॉल्वमेंट, जबकि सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज अ ग्रेट डील. तो हमारा मुसलसल जो वेटेज जा रहा है वो टुवर्ड्स सिस्टम 4 ज्यादा जा रहा है, बिकॉज दैट इज राइट नाउ इन द 21st सेंचुरी अप्लाइड वर्जन वो हमें अवेलेबल है. सो वी शुड नॉट बी वेस्टिंग द टाइम्स इन डेवलपिंग सिस्टम 1 2 और 3. ओके, सो to what extent, मैं sixth question पढ़ रहा हूं, to what extent are the rewards and encouragements given to subordinate. तो system 1 में there was no such system, जबकि system 4 जो participative style था it was a great deal. इसी तरह policies में are the policies clearly understood. सिस्टम 1 में नॉट एट ऑल. अगर आप टॉप डाउन अप्रोच को लेकर चलेंगे तो टॉप डाउन अप्रोच इज अ बिग फेलियर, अ टोटल डिजास्टर. जिसके बरक्स अगर हम पॉलिसीज को विद अ पार्टिसिपेटिव स्टाइल लेकर चलेंगे, हम एमबीओ प्रोसेसेस को यूज करेंगे, बहुत से हमारे पास टूल्स एंड टेक्निक्स हैं जिनसे कि हम पार्टिसिपेटिव स्टाइल को कॉल कर सकते हैं. तो सिस्टम 4 में इट वाज वेरी वेल एस्टैब्लिश्ड. इसी तरह क्वेश्चन नंबर 8 देखिए कि आर देयर अ लॉट ऑफ रूल्स एंड पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोसीजर्स अ पर्सन हैज टू नो टू गेट द जॉब डन. तो सिस्टम 1 में आपको चूंकि ऑटोक्रेटिक स्टाइल यूज करना था तो पॉलिसीज प्रोसीजर्स के जरिए हम लोगों को मैनेज करने की कोशिश करते थे, एंड इट वाज अ वेरी मच मैकेनिस्टिक टाइप ऑफ एनवायरनमेंट. जिसके बरक्स जब हम सिस्टम 4 में पहुंचते हैं तो यहां पर अब 8th क्वेश्चन का जो जवाब है दैट इज वेरी फ्यू. द रीजन बीइंग द एनवायरनमेंट इज मोर फ्लेक्सिबल, मोर एडेप्टिव, मोर ऑर्गेनिक. अब जब आपके पास एनवायरनमेंट मोर फ्लेक्सिबल, एडेप्टिव और ऑर्गेनिक होगी तो उसके बहुत से बेनिफिट्स जो थे दे वर ऑब्वियसली डेमोन्स्ट्रेटेड. इसी तरह पॉलिसीज के हवाले से 9th क्वेश्चन को देखिए कि आर देयर अननेसेसरी प्रोसीजर्स. तो ऑब्वियसली सिस्टम 1 was a disaster, was a total wastage, जिसमें के बहुत सारे प्रोसीजर्स इन्वॉल्व होने की वजह से a great deal of procedures were there which was actually causing the bottlenecks. जिसके बरक्स सिस्टम 4 की जो एनवायरनमेंट थी that was involving very few procedures and those procedures were even developed through the bottom up approach process. ठीक है. सो अब हम नॉर्मेटिव अप्रोच में देखते हैं कि नॉर्मेटिव अप्रोच की जो फर्दर डेवलपमेंट थी उसमें हमें क्या क्या पॉइंट्स वो मिल पाते हैं. अब उनमें हमारे पास जो सबसे पहला कॉन्टेक्स्ट डेवलप हुआ दैट इज द कॉन्सेप्ट कमिंग फ्रॉम ब्लैक एंड न्यूटन्स ग्रिड, जिसको मैनेजरियल ग्रिड का नाम भी दिया जाता है. सो ब्लैक एंड न्यूटन्स ग्रिड जो है फॉर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन डेवलपमेंट ओरिजिनेटेड फ्रॉम रिसर्च about managerial and organizational effectiveness. Okay, इस ग्रिड को भी हम in depth स्टडी करेंगे कि how the Black and Newton came up with the idea of organizational development context in terms of defining managerial and leadership perspectives. Secondly, Data gathered on organizational excellence from 198 organizations located in US, Japan, UK found that the two foremost barriers to excellence were planning and communication. ओके अब एक बहुत बड़ा सर्वे जैसा भी यहाँ पे पॉइंट में भी हम देख रहे हैं नॉर्मेटिव अप्रोचेस के तहत विच वाज लॉन्च्ड और ये बात देखी गई कि कम्युनिकेशन और प्लानिंग अगर इनको अप्रोप्रिएट मेथड्स के साथ ना किया जाए तो दे कैन बी द बिग बैरियर्स इन डेवलपमेंट टुवर्ड्स एक्सीलेंस. So the research resulted in a normative model of leadership, इसको managerial grid का हम नाम देते हैं. Next slide पर अभी आपसे शेयर करता हूं. So according to managerial grid, an individual's style can be described according to his or her concern for production and concern for people. ओके तो इनकी इन्वेस्टिगेशन के मुताबिक दो हमारे पास मेन एरियाज डेवलप हुए जिसके ऊपर बात की जा सकती है. वन वाज कंसर्न फॉर प्रोडक्शन एंड अदर वाज कंसर्न फॉर पीपल. और इसके 6 फेजेस हमारे सामने आते हैं मैनेजरियल ग्रिड की एस्टैब्लिशमेंट में. द फर्स्ट वन वाज ग्रिड सेमिनार which was a 1-week program where participants analyzed their personal style and learned methods of problem solving. The second aspect in the managerial grid, just phase 2 हमारे पास आ रही है, that was team development. The third phase was intergroup development. The fourth phase was an ideal model of organizational excellence, and it was developed and implemented. And the fifth phase was the model is implemented, obviously. And the sixth phase is an evaluation of the organization. So in 6-step processes से गुजरकर इस managerial grid की जो implication थी, that was actually visualized. Now, what was actually the managerial grid which Black and Newton came up with? So this is the demonstration of the Black Newton's managerial grid. There are actually two main concerns in this grid. One is concern for people, another is concern for production. और उसको फिर हमने 9 degrees में दोनों aspects को वो divide किया. In 9 degrees में divide करने के बाद we were actually available with 5 main areas of discussion. जिसमें कि हमने कंसर्न फॉर प्रोडक्शन एंड कंसर्न फॉर पीपल की डिफरेंट वैल्यूज लेकर उनको एवेल्युएट करने की कोशिश वो की. सो ड्रॉज ऑन बोथ studies to assess leadership style, concern for people, which is consideration and employee oriented perspective, or concern for production, which is more institutioning, structural detail and production orientation type of environment. So ये दो हमारे पास मेन कंसर्न्स आए. ऑब्वियसली इनके बैकएंड के ऊपर यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ मिशिगन एंड यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ओहायो स्टेट इन दोनों की जो रिसर्च थी दैट वाज आल्सो अंडर डिस्कशन. इस सारी डिस्कशन को जब हमने समराइज किया इस ग्राफ में, दैट इज सेड कि स्टाइल इज डिटरमिन्ड बाय पोजीशन ऑन द ग्राफ. कि आप इन 81 ये 81 बॉक्सेस आपके सामने हैं, आप इन 81 स्टाइल्स ऑफ लीडरशिप में कहां पर लाई करते हो और आपकी पोजीशन ही डिटरमिन करेगी कि आपको कौन सा स्टाइल ऑफ लीडरशिप जो है वो यूज करना है. So this is rather more in-depth analysis of what leadership grid is looking like. इस leadership grid को in-depth study करने के लिए I would request you to join the next Zoom session.